July 4th, 2025. Kerrville, Texas. The hill country bathed in sunshine, and the scent of pinewood seemingly untouchable in its Independence Day peace. The sky was a clear blue, songbirds chirped from oak branches, and along the Guadalupe River, families gathered grilling camping riding bikes and laughing together. At Louise Hayes Park, a favorite riverside campsite, the Harrow family from Fort Worth was enjoying their long-awaited holiday. 10-year-old Lily Harrow was a lively little girl, her shoulder-length brown hair bouncing as she darted about. She loved adventure stories and could never sit still for long. She pedaled her bike around the park, waving at strangers exploring the rocky banks of the river, as if it were her own private fairy tale world. Around 4:00 p.m., Lily asked her parents if she could go play by the riverbank with a group of kids who were collecting shells and chasing water striders. "I won't go far," she said, with a cheeky grin. Her mother, Rachel Harrow, waved her off, never imagining it would be the last time she'd see her daughter's sunlit smile that day. No one, not the meteorologists, not the locals, not even the fire station down the road had predicted the massive rain bands stretching from Fredericksburg, barreling into Kerr County, lurking behind the summer haze like a silent predator. At 4:47 p.m., the Guadalupe River's headwaters began to swell. Within 90 minutes, the river turned into a raging, furious torrent, swallowing the entire Louise Hayes riverbank and nearby parks, sweeping away trees, tents, bikes, and perhaps even people. Lily Harrow never came back. Rachel and her husband Daniel panicked. They ran around the park, calling out for their daughter, but no one had seen her, just a single purple sandal bobbing in the murky water. Kerrville police were called and rescue crews from Fredericksburg launched inflatable boats, upriver helicopters, scoured the banks, but not a trace of her. In less than 2 hours, Independence Day had turned into a collective nightmare. And little Lily Harrow, just 10 years old, became one of dozens reported missing in the most sudden, devastating flood Kerr County had ever seen. No one knew where she was. No one knew if she was still alive. The sky over Kerrville turned a leaden gray. Within minutes, the blazing summer sun smothered by heavy, low clouds as a chill wind whispered warnings through the pines. Along the Guadalupe River, people carried on with their celebrations oblivious. Music from a small speaker drifted shakily through the damp air, the smell of grilled meat still hanging in the thickening breeze. No one noticed that the river water had changed color, swirling muddy and dark, creeping higher, inch by inch, until it suddenly broke over the banks. On the far edge of the park, Lily stood atop a slick rock, holding a seashell she had just found, her eyes following the glinting water striders dancing across the surface. A strong gust tore through, lifting her brown hair into the air and snatching her little hat, sending it tumbling into the water. Instinctively, she leaned down to grab it. That's when the strange growl of the river rose up as if some giant beast lurking beneath the current had woken. A churning wall of water surged up the bank, swallowing the grass Lily stood on, sweeping her off her feet. In an instant, everything became chaos. Cold water wrapped around her small body, mud sucked at her shoes, and her breath scattered in the roar of the flood. She flailed, reaching for anything to hold her hand, catching a gnarled tree branch sticking out from the riverbank. She tried to pull herself up, but the current was too strong. The ground gave way beneath her, and the world turned into a swirling, suffocating brown void. Up on the riverbank, the Harrow family had no idea. The first wail of a fire truck siren pierced the park, and only then did the crowd begin to stir. People scrambled toward higher ground, scooping up children, leaving their belongings behind. Daniel Harrow sprinted along the bank, scanning the throng, his heart hammering, when he realized Lily was no longer where she'd been. Then he saw her little hat snagged on a pile of floating debris, and his stomach dropped. Kerrville police arrived fast, splashing through the mud, barking orders into the howling wind. Rescue crews in reflective gear charged in with inflatable boats, life vests, and floodlights. The radio crackled with urgent messages declaring Kerr County under a state of emergency, demanding immediate evacuation of all riverside areas. But to the Harrows, all of that became just noise, their eyes fixed on the raging river, clinging to the faintest hope. On the water, rescue boats carved through the torrent yellow beams of light, sweeping the frothy surface like searching eyes. Along both banks, rescuers probed each tree root and clump of reeds, calling out names of the missing. Everything unfolded like a waking nightmare. No one fully grasped what was happening. Only that instinct screamed at them to run, to save, to search. The rain kept pounding, the sky blackened, and thunder rolled overhead like some divine curse falling upon the once peaceful hill country. Meanwhile, Lily, carried far from where she fell, clung weakly to a rotting branch, her tiny body, shivering eyes shut tight as her strength ebbed in the flood's merciless grip. On the rescue team's radio, voices kept reporting names, locations, last sightings. One low, grim voice stood out clearly: Lily Harrow, 10 years old, female, last seen at Louise Hayes Park. Urgent. In the driving rain and howling dark, a life-or-death mission had begun. Night fell faster than anyone realized, as if Kerrville had been swallowed by a cold, relentless shadow. The street lamps flickered weak yellow, powerless, against the darkness tightening around the riverbanks. Rain pounded on tin roofs, drumming the swollen river into a deafening roar. The Guadalupe was no longer the gentle river of that morning, but a giant serpent thrashing under the floodlights, its tail sweeping everything away. On Highway 16, running along the east bank of Kerrville, lines of fire trucks, ambulances and rescue trucks from Kennedy and Fredericksburg kept arriving. An ambulance door banged open, and a FEMA worker jumped out, handing the local sheriff an updated list of the missing. Names were crossed off quickly in red, when bodies were found in blue, when survivors were located. But near the bottom, one line remained blank next to the words Harrow Lily, 10F, last seen 16/20. Louise Hayes Park, status unknown. On the river, motorboats continued sweeping both sides of the current. Searchlights scanned tree roots, mossy bridge pillars, and unexpected little islands of debris jutting up from the murky surface. Rescuers in black rubber suits, thick life vests, and harnesses leaned over the edges of their boats, eyes locked on the churning water. Now and then, a branch or a scrap of tarp caught in the beam would make hearts leap, but each time they shook their heads and moved on. Another team trudged slowly along the south bank, where water had swallowed the park lawn. They slogged through thick mud up to their calves, flashlights cutting shaky circles through the rain. The only sign left of Lily was a small sandal still caught in a tuft of grass at the water's edge. A young rescuer picked it up, holding it for a long, heavy moment, as a chilling reminder that someone was still out there alone. Farther downstream, almost a mile and a half from Louise Hayes, Lily still clung to a log that had lodged against the opposite bank. The cold had sunk deep into her, her lips turning pale, her arms numb. Rain poured endlessly, wind, howled waves slapped muddy spray across her face. Once or twice she opened her eyes, catching faint glimpses of golden light flashing far off, and shut them again, too weak to call out. Her tiny frame curled tighter, threatening to slip into the current at any moment. At the temporary command post on high ground, rescuers took turns poring over hastily printed satellite maps, marking areas already swept. Every time a team returned, the room fell silent, then sagged in disappointment at another shake of the head. Sheriff Whitaker, his weathered face hard under the rain, clutched Lily's photo in his hand, his eyes dark with worry. He knew time was running out. In temperatures like this, in water like this, a child her size couldn't hold out much longer. Close to midnight, a call suddenly crackled through the radio, cutting the tense air. A team downstream had spotted small, muddy handprints on a rock a few meters above the waterline. Instantly, two boats swung around, floodlights blazing as they ripped through the dark. On the shore, the remaining rescuers scrambled down the muddy paths, flashlights bobbing through the black. The once muted scene came alive. Every eye, every breath, every step now aimed toward that faint, desperate clue. On a high tree branch, Lily opened her eyes again, faintly hearing the distant hum of engines somewhere out there. On the far bank, a light blinked on, then off, then swept wide and bright, cutting through the thickness of the night. For a moment, though, her hands were slipping and her body failing. Her eyes stayed open, hope beginning to flicker in the dark. A beam of light swept across the water, then another cutting into the darkness like golden blades. The engines roared through the rain as two rescue boats surged forward, steering hard against the current. Their floodlights burned through the black, scanning the river's surface and both banks in wide arcs. On the south shore, the ground team arrived. Flashlights bobbed along the water's edge, their beams fractured by the rain streaking across the mud and reeds. Each rescuer carried a fragile hope that weighed heavier with every sinking step through the sludge. They made their way toward the spot where tiny handprints had been found, pressed into a wet stone, a silent plea left behind. Amid the rain and the wind, high on a tree branch on the far bank, Lily opened her eyes once more. She saw the light. A shaft of brightness struck her, then veered away, then swung back landing square on the trembling figure clinging to the tree. In that instant, as though by some small miracle, the spotlight froze. The beam held steady on the tiny body curled against the wood, pale hands gripping desperately. On the boat, a rescuer leaned over the edge, squinting through the downpour. He slapped his teammate's shoulder sharply, and both men locked eyes. Instantly, both boats swung around, engines screaming as they cut hard toward the far bank. One sharp blast of the siren followed, echoing through the night, and back at the command post, everyone turned at once toward the river. On the opposite shore, the ground team froze, their flashlights raised. The points of light trembled, faintly reflected in the water, like worried eyes, all fixed on the same spot. Lily's grip faltered, her hands shaking now, not just from the cold, but from the surge of panic rising in her chest. The water below writhed with debris, tree limbs, and black shapes twisting in the current. The wind gusted again, the branch swayed, and her small feet slipped farther down the slick wood. But when that light burned into her eyes and stayed there, something deep inside her clung harder, hope beginning to flicker through the fear. The boat pressed in close, its spotlight locked on her. One rescuer hurled a grappling hook to a jagged rock, anchoring them steady in the current. The other slipped off his life vest, wrapped a safety rope tight around his chest, and cinched the knot. He stepped to the edge of the boat boots, sinking into the wet deck as his eyes never left her. His flashlight beam cut through the sheets of rain, catching the fragile figure swaying on the tree limb. Water streaked down his face, but his gaze was steady, fixed on her like she was the only thing in the world that mattered. On shore, everyone stopped staring. There were no more shouted orders, no more rushing. Only breaths held tight, mingling with the roar of the river and the hammer of the rain. The air hung heavy, taut with a quiet faith. Just a few feet away now, Lily felt the strength of that presence beneath her. In her blurred vision, a golden shape grew larger, clearer, and finally came to a halt directly below. A gloved hand lifted, reaching up toward her, silently waiting. And then, in the freezing wind, those small fingers slowly let go of the tree and stretched forward, trembling to meet his. For a moment, the spotlight burned brighter, capturing the sight of two hands gripping each other, tightly suspended in the driving rain over the raging river. Lily's tiny fingers clung desperately to the gloved hand reaching for her. The grip was weak and trembling, but it was enough for the rescuer to feel the faint warmth of life still there. He tightened the rope around his chest, dug his boots hard into the slick stone, and pulled himself closer. The river sprayed up into his face, mud clung to his sleeves, but his eyes never left hers, wide and terrified, yet still open. The crackle of radios carried over the roar of rain and water, alerting the rest of the team that the moment had come. On the shore, flashlights trained on the spot breaths held a stillness, settling as they watched. The boat rocked hard with the current, the rope strained and sang against the hook, then slackened slightly as he edged closer. And then Lily began to slip. The rotting branch beneath her groaned and cracked, splintering under her weight, and the relentless pull of the river. That sound cut through the air, freezing everyone. But in the same instant, the rescuer dropped low, lunged forward, and wrapped both arms around her. His hands locked over her shoulders, pulling her hard against his chest. A small cheer broke from the far shore as the lights illuminated the two figures clinging to each other, one large, one small, silhouetted against the torrent. The rescuer stepped back slowly, 1 foot at a time, his rope straining as he dragged himself and the girl back toward solid ground. Mud roots and stone fought against him, but he pressed on inch by inch, refusing to let go. The boat shifted closer, bobbing in the current. Hands reached out from above as he got close enough, lifting Lily's shivering, limp body into the boat. The sound of the cable groaning filled the air as the boat tore free and swung out into the main channel. He climbed in right after her, soaked to the bone mud, streaked across his face and hands. Wrapped now in a thin silver thermal blanket, Lily's face was pale, her eyelids fluttering, her breath faint but still there. The rescuer crouched next to her, one hand lightly resting on her shoulder, his eyes glistening in the stark glare of the floodlights that painted the water below. On the shore ahead, everyone waited. As the boat angled into the shallows, dozens of flashlight beams converged on it. One figure rushed forward, arms already out, lifting Lily from the rescuer's arms, holding her tightly. Shouts, sighs, and the crackle of radios overlapped in a chaotic symphony of relief and disbelief. Daniel and Rachel Harrow stood frozen in the crowd, unable to believe what they were seeing. Rachel dropped to her knees, her hands over her mouth, sobbing uncontrollably, while Daniel stiffened, then broke into a run toward the boat. They both threw their arms around their daughter, clutching her close as her fragile chest rose and fell with faint, fragile breaths. The night was far from over. The rain still pounded down, but on the banks of the Guadalupe River that moment, a miracle had truly unfolded. The wail of the ambulance siren cut through the night as it climbed the muddy hill toward the field hospital. Red lights spun across black puddles, rain and sludge spraying up in arcs as the wheels churned. On the stretcher, Lily lay still, wrapped tightly in a thermal blanket, her small body shivering, brown hair plastered to her pale forehead. Inside the white tent, harsh neon lights cast a cold bluish glow, illuminating rows of cots lined up side by side. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol, wet earth, and tense bodies. Medics rushed to meet the stretcher, moving quickly, snapping on gloves as they transferred Lily to a cot in the corner. An oxygen clip was fastened to her finger, its little screen blinking uncertain numbers. A doctor bent down, shining a penlight into her eyes, listening to her lungs, examining the bruises and cuts streaking her arms and legs. A nurse wrapped gauze over the raw scrapes, another gently wiped the mud from her face and hands, each motion careful, as though afraid to wake her. Outside the tent, Daniel leaned against a pole, his soaked shirt clinging to his frame, hands clasped tight. His eyes were hollow, staring at the tarp, flapping in the wind, mind replaying the image of his daughter being lifted from the river. Rachel sat on the ground, palms covering her face, then dropped them just to look toward the cot again. Around them, the usual noises of the hospital seemed muffled, drowned beneath the relentless patter of rain on canvas and the faint, fragile beeping of the monitor. A nurse gestured for them to come closer. Daniel stepped slowly forward, Rachel stumbling behind. They stood by the cot, watching their daughter draw each heavy breath. Rachel laid her hand on Lily's forehead, smoothing back the wet strands of hair, her tears mixing with the raindrops still clinging there. Daniel took her tiny, limp hand and gave it a light squeeze. Outside, the radio crackled again, another name added to the missing list downstream. In that moment, Daniel looked up and locked eyes with the rescuer, standing silently in the doorway. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face streaked with mud and rain, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, simply stood there watching the family huddle over their daughter. The entire field hospital settled into a slow, heavy stillness. Beyond the canvas, rain lashed harder. Ambulance lights flashed across the yard, catching the haggard, weary faces of rescuers preparing for yet another round. The night was far from over. The river hadn't yet receded. The list of missing still grew. But in that corner of the tent, amid all the sorrow and fatigue, Lily Harrow was still breathing, and that was miracle enough for them to hold on to. The night crept on over the high hill where the field hospital glowed faintly through the drizzle. The rain had softened now, falling in a quiet, steady rhythm, like a whisper from the heavens. Inside the white tent, medics dozed in chairs slumped next to hanging IV bags, swaying slightly with each gust of wind. In the corner, Lily still lay quietly, her breathing steadier, a faint blush of pink returning to her cheeks after fluids and warmth. Rachel had stayed at her side the entire time, never looking away. Her hands clasped tightly at her chest lips, murmuring prayers. Around her neck, a small silver cross glistened wetly in the light. Behind her, Daniel rested a hand on her shoulder, bowed his head and closed his eyes. His own whispered prayers mingled with Rachel's shaky words, forming a calm undercurrent amidst the tense silence. Outside, the wind swept over the hill, sighing through the pines, as if carrying back a quiet reply from the sky. The thunder had finally stopped. At the far end of the tent, a volunteer pastor from the town's small church knelt by a support pole, clutching his Bible eyes, lowered as he prayed softly. He glanced at the still child on the cot, then closed his eyes again, fingers resting on a verse that read, "Let the little children come to me. For the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these." Just then, Lily stirred faintly. A long breath escaped her cracked lips. Her eyelids fluttered and slowly opened. Rachel froze her hand, shooting out to grasp her daughter's, calling her name through tears she could no longer hold back. Daniel leaned forward, seeing those familiar brown eyes blinking weakly, settling at last on them with a faint, peaceful gaze. The pastor rose, slowly stepping closer, laying a hand gently on Rachel's shoulder and murmuring a quiet blessing. Rachel reached for his hand, whispering through sobs, "The Lord heard us." Outside, the clouds were finally breaking. The first faint streaks of dawn slipped through the pine canopy, falling gently across the soaked canvas. A fragile but steady beam of light spilled through the flap of the tent, catching the child's face, warming her pallid skin with the faintest glow. And in that quiet moment, everyone seemed to believe their prayers in the rain had truly been heard. Dawn broke fully, a soft, golden light filtering through the pines and onto the hill where the field hospital still stood. The air was heavy with moisture, wisps of mist rising from the mud and riverbanks below. The floodwaters had receded overnight, leaving behind streaks of silt, broken branches, and deep scars carved into the earth. At Louise Hayes Park, rescue trucks lined the river's edge, cranes slowly lifting twisted metal frames from the current. On the opposite bank, a team of rescuers sifted through debris piles, collecting what little remained. The hum of engines mixed with the occasional ambulance siren, but the frantic urgency of the night was gone. Only quiet fatigue remained. Inside the white tent, Lily was fully awake now, weak but alert. She lay still, eyes wide open, staring at the canvas ceiling where faint shafts of morning light filtered through. Rachel sat at her side, gently combing her daughter's hair, occasionally squeezing her small hand and smiling faintly despite her exhaustion. Daniel stood behind them, arms crossed, watching every breath she took. In a faint, raspy voice, Lily asked Mom, "Did God hear us?" Rachel's tired smile softened, and a tear fell onto her daughter's little hand as she nodded and whispered, "Yes, sweetheart. He always hears." A young rescuer brought in a bowl of warm soup, bowed slightly to the family, set it on the table, and quietly stepped back out. Outside, the man who had pulled Lily from the river still stood at the doorway, watching the sunlight spread across the valley. His jacket was still streaked with mud, his hands cracked and raw from the cold and the wet, but in his eyes was a quiet peace. When his gaze met Daniel's, the two men exchanged a silent nod. No words needed, just a deep, grateful acknowledgement. Down by the river, the town's pastor stood beside a rescue crew gathered in prayer before resuming their work. He read a familiar passage about faith and trial. The weary men and women around him bowed their heads in silence. A few slowly traced crosses over their chests. They too had endured a long night, clinging to the whispered prayers carried on the wind and rain. On the hill, the wind blew through the white tarps, lifting away the last chill of the storm, leaving behind the scent of wet earth and the faint promise of hope. As the sun rose higher, its light touched Lily's face, and for the first time since she was found, she smiled softly, her eyes catching the morning's glow. A night of hell had passed. A morning of grace had begun. By midday, the valley was bathed in brilliant sunlight. The last gray clouds drifted toward the horizon, revealing a sky of piercing blue, a jarring contrast to the nightmare of the night before. But Kerrville was no longer the quiet little town it had been. Along the riverbank, rescue trucks moved methodically, mud-streaked cables coiled on their decks, heaps of broken wood and debris piling higher. The list of missing, posted on a board near Louise Hayes Park, continued to grow. Each new name drawn onto it was met with a heavy sigh, eyes cast to the ground. Inside the field hospital, Lily could finally sit up, sipping warm soup from a porcelain bowl. Her small face was pale and tired, but her eyes shone with a strange brightness. Word of the little girl pulled from the flood that night spread quickly through the hospital and beyond. People came just to glance at her, a few older townsfolk crossing themselves quietly when they saw her whispering about the miracle of Kerrville. Rachel and Daniel greeted each rescuer, who entered their expressions softer, now tinged with quiet pride. They knew it was these people, and the hand of God they'd prayed to through the storm, who together had wrested their daughter back from death's grip. But outside, not every miracle had arrived in time. Black bags were discreetly carried from the riverside, one after another. Among the crowd, families wept, clutching the children who remained to their chests, as if letting go, even for a moment, might mean losing them too. One man dropped to his knees on the wet grass, burying his face in his hands and sobbing when he saw his son's name struck through in red. The town's pastor stayed by the river, standing beside a small wooden cross, hastily planted in the mud, murmuring prayers for every lost soul, every name still unaccounted for. He repeated again and again the verses about trials, about faith, about salvation. As the sun climbed higher, Lily was wheeled outside, wrapped in a thin blanket, onto the steps of the hospital to breathe in the fresh air. She looked down at the river below, now shrunken and sluggish, leaving only streaks of mud and puddles. Figures of rescuers still moved through the reeds, their flashlights glinting faintly as they worked on. She gripped her mother's hand and asked softly, "Will everyone get to go home?" Rachel paused, glancing down at her, then stroked her hair with a sad smile. "God hears them all, sweetheart, but sometimes He calls a few of them home first." And as the sunlight blazed down, the bells of the Kerrville church began to ring. Their peal rolled across the valley into damp rooftops and aching hearts, reminding all who heard that faith was still there, even amid the ruins. Afternoon settled over Kerrville in a gentle light, rarely seen after such a storm. Warm golden rays spread over the soaked rooftops, the green hills emerging once more after the raging waters had receded, leaving behind mud-streaked scars and stories that would never fade. Along the riverbank, once the heart of the flood, a few rescuers still worked, combing through reeds and rocks. Their flashlights swept across the muddy ground in quiet arcs, and the soft clang of church bells rang faintly from above. Inside the field hospital, Lily stood at the doorframe, now leaning against it watching. Her eyes held a new kind of wonder as she followed each slow, deliberate step of the men and women in reflective vests. Each of them was streaked with mud, weary to the bone, yet still bending low to search beneath roots, reaching into shallow pools, never wavering. Rachel knelt, wrapped her arms around her daughter, and whispered, "Do you see? God heard us." Lily looked up at her mother, then back at the rescuers outside, her small eyes seeming to grasp something she hadn't before. Then very softly she said, "God is them. Isn't he?" Mama Rachel froze for just a moment. Then her lips trembled into a smile as she hugged her daughter tighter and nodded. Outside, the rescuer who had pulled Lily from the river walked past. He didn't look up, just moved quietly, gripping the mud-streaked rescue rope in his hand as if holding on to some important memory. His eyes met theirs for a brief moment through the doorway, and in that instant, both Rachel and Lily felt an inexplicable calm fill the space between them. The rescuers went on with their quiet work. They bent into the mud, into the wounded river, clearing, searching, bringing home anyone still waiting out there, as though it wasn't just duty, but a calling. Each step they took, each hand they reached out, seemed to carry the prayers of the town upward to the heavens. And as the church bells rang again and the sunset poured its last golden light over the Kerrville banks, people bowed their heads once more. But this time they didn't just pray to a distant figure above. They silently gave thanks to those moving through the mud below, the hands of God reaching down through the storm to embrace the earth.